let's talk a bit about applying these principles of human systems agility in some of the practices of management. The managers need to learn how to deal with and structure and manage teams that are behaving in these extraordinary new ways. So teams that are leaderless, teams that are self-organizing, teams that are liberated to manage their own work. I had a wonderful experience where someone came into a meeting at a client and said, I just walked past the COBOL development team, and the COBOL team average age was in their 50s, right? You know, or more probably. And I just walked past the COBOL team and they're all standing around a Kanban planning their week's work, and their manager isn't even in this city. They're not here, they're not present, and that team's just doing it. And that was a wonderful moment. But you know, for that manager to let go and understand that the team's just going to stand around the Kanban and organize their own work for the week, that's quite transformational. But a second more interesting aspect of this is that managers need to learn to work as a team. And this isn't specifically about new ways, I guess. It would be nice if we did this in all organizations. But the more that managers are not focused inwardly on managing their own team, the more that they should be outwardly focused, spending more time with their peers, more time as a team, working together. Sure, you've got an agile team down here, which is the manager and their reports working together in new ways, but the managers themselves, so the peers at some level and their boss, are themselves a team and should start working and behaving more that way. So at various points within the organization, we've got these groups, and it's an interesting observation for me that in lots of organizations I go into, if I work with the CIO and their direct reports, that those direct reports do not function as a team. They're all in their own silos doing their thing, and the only time they come together is for the monthly meeting with the boss. And they have no capability to function with each other as a team. And so we're going to stop micromanaging, right? And we're going to draw back from being totally immersed in the silo below us in the hierarchy. We should be spending more time working together across the organization, collaborating across the silos as a management team. It gets called a management team, but most of the ones I meet are not a team at all. So that's one aspect to think about. Teams are interesting, and this is a tool that comes out of Plays in Business, which to function as a team, it's really valuable to spend a bit of time on values and on having a common cultural consensus. And so this is quite a good tool to go through with a team in a workshop and just say, you know, what's our charter? What do we all subscribe to as a team? And some of them will think this is way too lovey-dovey and new age, but even the ones who don't really emotionally engage with it at the time will find themselves later referring to it. And it's an important general principle of new ways of working, that if your principles and your policy are clear, then you don't have to think so much about the decisions when they come up. Decisions are almost automatic if you've all agreed on principles and policy in advance. So another aspect to think about in terms of practices is and we're still kind of big picture on management here, but agile governance. So something that we're very passionate about at Teal Unicorn is that there is this cascade where governance provides the values and direction to executive leadership, executive managers, who lay out the principles for the organization to management, which directs management to work in new ways to improve the system. And by changing the system or stimulating the system to change, as we'll talk about, that encourages the new ways of working, which changes the work, which ultimately changes the behaviors, which changes the culture. So culture is an emergent property of the system. It's not an input. And so this cascade flows down to ultimately modify the culture of the organization. And Boeing is a beautiful example of where all this goes wrong, because as soon as governance starts directing for stakeholder capitalism and optimizing the value of the shareholder, that poison flows all the way down through the system until the quality of work goes out the door and the culture becomes a broken culture. So this cascade's really important. And so ultimately you work your way back up to say that governance has to change the way it governs. The organization has to ultimately decide to want to be a beta organization. It has to ultimately decide it wants to be different to how it is now. And so the thing that we think is our special focus at Teal Unicorn is that as you go down that cascade, it gets stuck, it gets locked when management don't change. And this is the bit that often gets overlooked when organizations are trying to move to new ways, is devoting some time and effort on unlocking the management, that frozen middle, and unfreezing it and allowing the change to flow down through the organization. In order to free up all that, you know, risk management risk is one of the key things that stops managers moving, and ultimately it's one of the things that stops governance moving. And as I say, Boeing's a beautiful example of where the things they've done to be conservative have actually increased risk rather than reduced risk. And so the hard thing we have to communicate is that the new ways of working are actually reducing risk, not creating risk. And there are ways we can demonstrate that, but there will always be a residual risk. So there's this myth in conventional management of zero risk. You know, there's this myth that you can keep driving risk down until you're trying to work towards a hypothetical goal of zero risk. And we've got to let go of this idea that you should endlessly reduce risk. That stuff happens. You're always going to have risk. And so acceptance of risk and embracing risk and understanding that there's no way you can get out all the risk is part of business. And the things that happen could take you out of business. So Knight Capital is a famous one that gets bandied around all the time that many of you will have heard about, which was a company where the one sysprog one made one mistake and took the company out. Bam, gone, out of business. Sold and devoured by the competitors, bought up, trashed, 20 minutes to destroy the company. There's no way you can mitigate against that risk. The specific risk was manageable. There are things they could have done to prevent that thing from happening. But the reality is that you can't preempt every possible future scenario. Things happen, and some of those things could even potentially take. That's the risk, right? It's like walking down the street. You know, walking down the street's not zero risk, and never will be zero risk. So, and another one of the fallacies with risk management is this idea that once the probability is below some threshold, it's not going to happen. So management look at risk and they say less than 5%, less than 5%, less than 5%. That means these scenarios are not going to happen. And that's just as a complete failure to understand what statistics and probability means, right? The probability that this thing will happen is not less than 5%. The probability that this thing will happen is 50% for anything in the world. It's either going to happen or it's not. All that the probability tells you is that if this thing was happening over and over and over again many times, proportionately only 3 or 4% of the time would it happen. But for any one event coming up, is this going to happen or not? The probability is 50-50. You don't know until you do. So that less than 5% thing, it tells you nothing about a single future scenario. Nothing at all. It only tells you about thousands of future scenarios. And yet management think because it's below 5%, it's being mitigated away. No, it's not going to happen. And then when it does happen, they're like, you said it was less than 5%. It means nothing, right? It's one of the few things I understood from doing stats. So when stuff does happen, the new way of managing is what? Is to learn from it, not punish it. We talked about this yesterday. And that means the correct response to things going bad is learnings and improvements, not controls and punishments. But conventional management is every time something goes wrong, put some more controls in. And that just means that the whole organization slowly accretes more and more controls until eventually it collapses under the weight of its own control system, which is a pretty good description of most of the legacy organizations I know, where they just slow down to the point where they just can't function anymore. So we have to create a culture where we accept the risk. We accept that things are going to go wrong. We will roll with things that go wrong, and we will learn from them. And to understand what could go wrong, we will listen to the Gemba. We'll listen to the people who actually know. We won't let some middle manager pull some number out of the first available orifice to decide what the risk is. We'll listen to the people, as Boeing should have listened to the people down in the factories who were telling them for years that things were going wrong with the quality of their planes. I've gone from being someone who loved Boeings as bulletproof aircraft to somebody who would think twice about getting into one now. Let's talk a little bit about finance. Projects don't go away. At some level in the organization, there is this idea that we are doing a big surge of work, a step change in the capability of the organization. We're rolling out a new product, or we're, deploying to a new country, or whatever. There's a big change going on. And so there are still big machines in the organization rolling out with big lumps of work. And Agile, as you know, is we bung all this work in a hopper, and then we munch it up maybe into quarterly chunks or monthly chunks or sprintly chunks. And we drop that work into the hoppers of various standing teams to work on. This is the basic Agile model at scale. And so the interesting thing about finance is that those projects are turning up with these huge lumps of money, and we need to somehow take those huge lumps of money and grind the money down into continuous streams to fund these standing teams. And so within IT, where IT is trying to work in these new ways within an organization that isn't yet, or any other place where we're in a bubble working in these new ways, this is a huge problem. And so until the organization evolves that this is the standard way of thinking, we've got to crunch the money up ourselves somewhere, and we'll talk about that a bit more another time. But Agile finance is about not dumping lumps of money down at the workplace, and it's turning the money into flows of money that we can go forward with. And so who's heard of beyond budgeting? So beyond budgeting is one of the references I'll give you. It's a whole body of knowledge around not doing money in big annual lumps, but turning it into agile flows of money. And there's one or two other frameworks, but this is the leading one around thinking about agile finance. It's not anything like zero-based budgeting, which is still an annual lump thing. Beyond budgeting is about agile flows of money. And there are other mechanisms. There's a really good book called Internal Market Economics, Dean Meyer, which is about apportioning the money out, but then it's just a marketplace. People buy and sell and spend money according to their needs between each other within the organization, which is another way of, it's still budget related, but it's another way of providing fluidity to how you do your finance. So internal markets or beyond budgeting, there are ways to do it. It's a solved problem is my short answer to people when they worry about it. It's like, I'm not an expert in this, but it's a solved problem. People do it. There's a whole bunch of functions within the organization that need to think in agile ways. And if you Google around, there are people thinking about this in most of these domains that I've listed here. There's a new framework for agile sales, for example. And for a lot of them, they're very emergent spaces, right? Where there isn't generally accepted practice. People are just experimenting. And I've seen the same with agile marketing and agile HR, and which we're going to talk about in a minute. And quite often what they've done is they've taken the Agile Manifesto and they've just changed the words so that it's applicable in the domain that they're trying to work in. That's a starting point. So certainly I've seen an Agile HR Manifesto and I've seen an Agile Marketing Manifesto. So in all of these spaces, and I'm going to give you a video to watch for homework in the Agile service space around a call center transformation. And of course, Agile IT is where it all started. It's recently, the whole new ways of thinking. The epicenter of it is IT, which is fascinating. We've gone from being the backroom Neanderthal trolls that Dilbert depicts us as, to actually being the thought leaders within organizations in new ways of working. And I've seen a number of instances where IT gets asked to lead the advance of the whole organization into new ways of working because it's coming out of IT, which is pretty cool. So, we are thought leaders in the world within IT with these things. I drew a picture just for the purposes of this course, and I was quite happy with how it came out, that as we get agile and thinking about how we build stuff, we then, also get agile and thinking about how we deploy it, which is where DevOps came from within the IT world. And we get agile and thinking about how we operate it, which is maybe like Google SRE is coming from that perspective to think about agility operation. And we get agile and thinking about how we're going to support those systems. We get agile and thinking about how we design them, and design thinking and product management and so on. They're all advancing rapidly in this space of agile ways of working. To a large extent, they were leaders in the design space and thinking about this. And then we start transforming how we think about portfolio management of work, and the ripple rolls out to where we're pushing the organization to say, what's your product catalog? What? And how are you going to manage programs of work in these agile ways, streaming us features instead of great big lumps and projects and so on. And we have to start transforming demand management. We have to start getting the organization to understand some of the principles that stop them just pushing work all the time, and understand that we have to pull work or else we'll overwhelm our systems and yada, yada, yada. There's a lot of change goes on there. As the build function in the middle starts becoming agile, that drives all these areas it interacts with to become agile as well. The epicenter was for sure IT software development. That's where agile fire got lit, but it stimulated change, it drove, it demanded change in all these areas that engaged with it. And then that ripple rolls out to then influence the functions in the wider organization that interact with that, to have to start thinking differently as well. So if we're deploying software every day, or every 3.5 seconds, if you're a unicorn, then, Amex deploy 47,000 times a day, right? What does the business do with that? The release function, how do we roll this out to our users, has to start thinking very differently as well. The organization has to start thinking about how they frame their requirements differently. When design is saying we want to pull a stream of features, we don't want to pull whole great big 0-1 changes. We change how we think about funding the work. We change how we think about prioritizing the work, because we finally teach them that you can't just keep shoving stuff down the pipe. You're going to explode everything. We have to control demand. You have to start prioritizing work, because we're going to pull it when we're ready for it. So that shifts their thinking about work. And so that drives them planning quite differently. And so the strategizing and high level planning of the organization shifts. and they shift how they assess the results of the work and understand what we're doing and think about how they understand that. And they change how they review the operations of the work to create feedback loops about how it's going. And of course, it changes how they use the systems, and it changes how they repair their systems, because support is operating differently and they interact with that differently, and they understand that they can flow requirements to fix things differently. And it changes how they maintain those systems and don't think about refreshing them once every 5 years, but think about refreshing them constantly, for example. And it changes ownership, because we're saying, who's the product owner, right? Who's going to engage with us daily, weekly, and monthly on this stuff? You can't just run away for 3 years and wait for us, right? And it changes how they think about the need for new systems. That's a pretty groovy picture. I liked that. It sort of fell out and I was like, not the worst thing I ever drew. I'm going to use this more. But this is this idea that you start with thinking differently about how you build stuff, and it ripples out to influence the whole operating model of the organization, ultimately. And then that in turn is going to heavily influence the governance. That I could probably do another circle or another little bit on the top or something about the broader environment outside that. So I hope that stimulates you as much as it stimulated me. I really enjoyed drawing that just yesterday. Now, a big area that gets impacted, so I give it a whole slide on its own, is agile personnel management. And I detest the term HR, and I'm really trying to drive it out of my language, but I have to use it just to tell people what I'm talking about. We're going to stop calling it HR, because we're not human resources, right? We're not machines. We're not plug compatible wetware. That term's just got to be drummed out. And we thought a lot about what to call it. People management is too vague in general, but that would be good. Personnel management was good enough for my dad. It's good enough for me. That's what I'm using for now. You can have all sorts of new agey terms as well people are using, right? They're talking about, I hate human capital. They've gone from human resource to human capital, like that's somehow better, but I don't think it is at all. But I don't care what you call it, just don't call it human resources, right? They're people, they're colleagues and human beings. I'm using the term personnel management for now in the book. It was the rise of Friedmanism in the 80s to say they're just another resource. We got money, we got information, and we got people. They're our resources, you know, they're just an asset of the company. People are our greatest asset. Really, you don't own me. When they were industrial workers and agricultural workers and slaves and clerical people, they need the job, they need the money, so you do own them. Work so bad you have to pay people to do it, you know, right? And you own them. But knowledge workers, that you employ them because of their skills and their capability and their professionalism, and those are highly portable attributes of those people. They're mobile. They can get up and leave and go somewhere else anytime. And suddenly you don't own them anymore. Suddenly it's more important what staff think about the manager than it is what the manager thinks about the staff. And so the whole power dynamic has shifted. And this is changing how we think about personnel management. There are two primary kinds of management for any person in the organization. There's personnel management and there's work management. And the more we can separate those out, actually, the more sane the world gets. This has been done in the past with things like matrixed management structures in organizations, and HBR, Harvard Business Review, have been talking about helix management. So there are two spirals, like a DNA of management. There's the management of the people and there's the management of the work. And if you separate those out, then as an individual, I have a relationship with a work manager and I have a relationship with a personnel manager. And that personnel manager takes care of me as a person and my needs as a person and as an employee. And that work manager takes care of the work I'm currently working on. And if I change what I'm working on, I'll change my work manager, but I won't change my personnel manager. And it's a bit like, as an IT analogy, we always said have incident and problem managers being different people, because they have totally different goals and imperatives. And if it's the same person, they'll have huge conflict in their head dealing with what's going on. And in the same way, if a personnel manager cares about you, but a work manager wants you to do more work, then if it's the same person, they're in this huge conflict. So I think it's a really powerful fundamental concept to say, let's get these separated out and have somebody doing, and the other thing it does is, project managers are really good at work management. The people who are employed as project managers are really good at work management. I have to say that as a broad sweeping generalization, they tend to suck at personnel management. Am I right? And the sort of people who are really good people managers and really good at building a team and growing people don't always be terribly good at managing work. I've seen this really clear. They're just the type of people. People tend to kind of be better at one of those than the other. And they're a less common beast who's good at both of them. So let's drive this separation into two actual types of managers doing two different things, and understand the distinction and keep it apart. So I think that's a powerful concept, and I'm going to keep working on that and driving that going forward. So then you have specifically the personnel function, and I'm a big believer that we will never get away from specialized divisions within the organization. IT's gone, there will be no IT anymore, it's just spread around the business. Bollocks. There are specialist skills that need to be centralized in centers of excellence, even if some of the functionality spreads around the business. And in the same way, managers should do their own HR, they should recruit their own people and grow their staff themselves, and we don't need HR anymore. Bollocks. There will always be a centralized function who are accountable and responsible for focusing on the development and welfare of people and so on. There will always be a function, but it has to change quite radically in how it thinks and what it does. And so one of the areas that get impacted is recruitment. And I talked about this a bit yesterday. Having a specific role you want to fill, and at that moment dipping in the market to see who's available, is actually a really stupid strategy. It's like having something you want to buy and dipping into eBay just today to see if you can buy it. Right? It's much better to just be constantly recruiting for good people who fit your organization, are the kind of people you want. And then when you land a good person, figuring out where they best fit in the organization. And the more that people self-organize around work, the more you can just chuck someone into the pool and they will find their own space, right? So it completely flips how we think about recruitment. There's a dangerous idea, recruit for cultural fit, which is very much in vogue. And it's correct in the sense that you want someone who's going to fit into your organization, but you have to be very careful that that doesn't mean recruit clones. You have to be very careful that you're still recruiting for diversity. So the first place I worked when I finally finished university was a brilliant New Zealand company many decades ago now. And a little old lady in a twin set in pearls invited me into a room, sat me down on the other side of a little round table with a lace tablecloth on it and tea in china cups. And she sat down and said, "Hello, dear, and welcome." And we drank tea together and we had a little chat for an hour. And then I left. And the other recruiters I'd been talking to were from Digital Equipment Corporation, IBM, Hewlett Packard, right? And which was all alpha white males in suits. And suddenly this little old lady had a chat with me and didn't ask me any real, but as I was walking away, I realized she'd found out 10 times as much about me as any of the other recruiters had. And I thought, shit, I want to work for those people. That's brilliant. And when I went to work for them, I discovered that she was a brilliant recruiter, you've never seen such an assorted bunch of misfits as in that organization. It was the bar scene from Star Wars, right? They were just the most incredible assortment of people, but they were all, if I, humility aside, they were all really, really clever people. And we did amazing things. She got it way back then. She was recruiting for fit, but fit did not mean looking like the other people working there. I can tell you that. Right, so recruitment is getting transformed. A big challenge to conventional HR is the idea that we build skills, not roles. And so they've got all these huge books full of job descriptions that say what you do and where you fit in the hierarchy, right? And suddenly we come along and go, well, there isn't really a JD for this. We just kind of want people, and we understand what skills we want to develop amongst them, but no, there's not really a specific role. In fact, we want them to shift roles all the time. We want them to flow between roles. We want roles to overlap between people. It just does their heads in. And so at New Zealand's biggest government department, when I was working there, the HR function had a woman assigned permanently in IT, full-time working, just trying for them to get their heads around and keep up with what we were doing in IT, because it was blowing the whole system away. And she was working 100% for the CIO, just trying to modify HR to keep up with them, which is a, you know, a big tribute to what they were doing. But that's the kind of thing HR is going to have to do in the future to keep up with the world. KPIs, right, and all this kind of stuff gets completely meshed in the Agile world, because I said yesterday, you can't measure individuals with numbers. You can't measure knowledge workers with numbers. The value of a knowledge worker is not measured by numbers. KPIs can be a very powerful and useful thing, but they can also be an incredibly dangerous thing. And if we actually use them to evaluate people, then harm is going to be done. There's a lovely Deming quote that if you give a manager a metric to meet, he will meet it even if he destroys the organization in the process. So you set the wrong KPIs and you tell people you're measuring them by it, and all you'll do is screw your culture. And another way to use that analogy that I like is you can drive a car without a dashboard. Right? My son and I, we hack old New Zealand cars. We know you can drive a car without a dashboard in it, right? The car will still work. You can still function. You can still have a rough idea how fast you're going. You still get around corners with no dashboard in the car. And so a good manager can manage without a dashboard. A dashboard is just there to help you drive. And it's there to help you meet compliance a lot of the time too, like speed limits, right? That's what a dashboard's for. A dashboard's there to tell you that the engine's overheating, you're running out of oil. But if you're a good driver, you can smell that and hear that. So managers who drive by dashboards are bad managers. Managers who manage by numbers are bad managers. I'll say that, I'll argue that one in the pub all night long. Numbers are just a helpful tool. They're not how we manage an organization well. And some of the best people I knew had some of the worst numerical results for their work. Then I alluded to this just a moment ago, you know, that we're really messing up HR's heads with seniority and pay bands and all this kind of thing. What are the career paths you can go up without going into management where you still get increasing seniority and pay? And so we're getting HR to think about a whole lot of new ideas to deal with that. And performance reviews, you've probably by now seen all these articles around, you know, kill the performance review. There are organizations who just said, we're not going to do this anymore. Why are we not going to do it anymore? Because it's theatre. I think back to all the performance reviews I went along to or that I did of staff, and they were pure theatre, right? The manager didn't really know a lot of the stuff I'd been doing. I didn't really know about my staff when I was reviewing them. I worked on what little I knew about them to come up with some sort of bullshit to tell them what they had to improve in the next quarter. And then I had to assign numbers to them for my managers that were as best I could do, but they were crap. And all that these performance reviews do is they destroy morale, because everybody knows it's bullshit theatre and everybody knows it's unfair and doesn't really represent what the value is. And on both sides, the person doing the review and the person receiving it. It's just toxic. So there's so many organizations who are just abandoning them, or at least changing them radically into what they mean and how they work. We have to completely change the way we think about performance management of people as well. You can't just hit people with a stick anymore. It's not acceptable, and they'll just go somewhere else. In the old days, they had to stay and be beaten and work faster, but that doesn't work anymore. And so performance management is about encouraging people to want to do better. It's not about beating them up until they do. I'm quite passionate about firing people. That I said yesterday, if you have to fire someone, there's a 50-50 chance you should fire their manager as well. We should have systems where it becomes very rare that we ever need to fire someone. And when we do need to fire someone, it's violence. It is just like shooting someone culturally. And so unless everybody agrees that the best thing to do was to shoot that person and organization, then you are going to do cultural damage when you fire them. If a manager decides to fire someone and lots of people in the organization think that was the wrong thing to do and that was unfair, then the damage to the culture is immense. And even if people will agree that it was a good thing to do, you still shot someone. And so in terms of trust relationships and power dynamics, they know you're the kind of person who, when push comes to shove, will fire someone. And so there's always that little niggle in the back of their minds forever in their relationship with you. It never goes away. It's that lizard brain fight or flight thing. I saw this lizard kill another lizard. No matter how much I trust this lizard, I know it has the potential to do that. Have you ever heard firing talked about in that way before? We're heavily driven by American business culture, and American business culture uses firing as a standard tool all the time. And it's very, very alpha, very, very red, in fact, black. It's street gang level management. And so I think that's been a negative. The whole Friedmanism thing, greed is good. I mean, that's driven by American cultural imperialism, by the fact that the whole world's thinking is influenced. One of the biggest influences on world culture is American culture, in the same way as it used to be British culture, and not even just English-speaking countries. You know, Vietnam, my God, is it American capitalist now, right? With this weird communist dictatorship overlay, but that doesn't change it. You know, that cultural influence is a lot of that is what we're trying to unravel. The last 30 years of Friedmanism is what we're trying to unravel. So a whole slide on firing would be an interesting one, because it should be the last of last resorts. If somebody's not flourishing, you change the conditions, right? Or you move the plant, right? If someone's not flourishing, it's because management failed to find the spot where they flourish, or management failed to create the conditions for them to flourish. In a very small number of cases, it's someone who is totally dysfunctional and needs to be removed. But a lot of the time, the dysfunction is from the system, not from the individual. And really quite dysfunctional people can have huge value in an organization if the organization wraps. So people who are on the autistic spectrum, there's a big shift now to embrace those people in organizations and find ways to make them comfortable, because we are highly creative people. We think in different ways to neurotypicals, right? And that value should be harnessed, not driven out of the organization. And so it's creating cultures where people where we understand that we're not standardized blocks that can just be plugged together like Lego, and we can't be beaten into the shape of a Lego block, and that we should, you know, accommodate people and find places where they can contribute value. Then it becomes very, very much a last resort to actually eject them from the organization. There's a phrase we use that we love is flourishing. And to me, it captures everything about what a gardener manager is trying to do. And so we talk to clients about having a flourishing program, about wrapping all this stuff together as an HR function, as a personnel management function, to say, these are the things that we should have a conscious program ongoing all the time to ensure in our organization. And you see it now, don't you? You see chief happiness officer or, you know, things like this in organizations where there is somebody accountable and doing this work. In order to be successful, yes, you need support from the top, but there's a problem I call rabbit stew. So it was Mrs. Beaton's cookbook said, you know, the recipe for rabbit stew, item 1 was first catch your rabbit, right? And it's kind of like, well, what if I don't have a rabbit? You know, there's all these things that say it is essential to have executive support in order to and it's like, well, yeah, okay, but what if I don't? Right at the moment I don't, so what do? So at some point executives have to come on board and support. But for a lot of organizations, if you said you can't start till you have executive support, then that would be a showstopper. I love that phrase, think global, act local. You know, we aspire to transforming the whole organization, but we can start at home. To the gardener analogy, again, finding a receptive bit of soil in the organization to start with. I have a model that I use, which is observational, that there seems to be a pattern, roughly, that organizations can explore and experiment with new ways of working locally before there's any sort of executive support. And sometimes you have a permission to do that, and sometimes you do it guerrilla even. But you can have pockets and things going on for quite a long time. You know, this could be a very long bar on the bottom before something happens to stimulate the organization into thinking about new ways of working. Something happens, and it could be a negative thing, it could be a crisis, like suddenly we all have to work remotely, but it could be a merger, it could be just a new boss comes in and wants to be the boss who's seen to do everything differently. But there's some trigger point that stimulates the most senior people in the organization to say, oh my God, we need a new way of working, right? And for a sufficient number of people in the organization, a critical mass of people to agree and say, you're right, boss, we need a new way of working. And so when that time comes along, then the mandate comes down, somebody go and incubate a new way of working. Somebody work on this, grow what is the new way of working for our organization, figure it out, the new way of working. And the organization as a whole mentally starts on this journey of we're going to figure out a new way of working. And then as that new way of working grows to something that can be used, we start to adopt it across the organization. And hopefully we adopt it iteratively. That's what those little wave lines are. We don't go big bang. We start adopting this widely, which creates a feedback loop then to be constantly changing the new way of working, what we're incubating. And the interesting observation for me is that, or several observations out of that. One is that as we start adopting it more and more widely, that ends up transforming the operating model of the organization, which is that picture I drew earlier of those, you know, the build going out to all the functions around the build, going out to all the broader functions in the organization. As we adopt new ways of working, the ripples go out in the organization that we actually pull behavior wider and wider because people need to start working in new ways. And ultimately, we end up transforming the operating model of the organization. It was really funny. I'd get called in, come and talk to us about DevOps. And people would think I was coming in to talk about automating a few Linux servers, and I'd end up talking about changing the world. I'm like, whoa, wait, what? You know, but this is the logical progression. But that explore phase can go for a long time before something triggers the organization to have the appetite to do this organization-wide. But when it does happen, it's good that you can open a drawer and say, hey, that's interesting, boss. Here's some stuff we've been working on already. To John's point, here are some proof points we've already got at pockets in the organization to throw into the pot when we incubate new ways of working. Here's a whole lot of capabilities and ideas and proofs and pilots and things we've got in the explore time. And it's really important. I use this model when I first go into an organization to understand where they are at. And if they're in explore mode, there's no point going up to the CEO with a big fancy presentation about the great new world, because that big lightning bolt hasn't happened yet. They're not going to listen. There is an alternate model, which is the Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point, that if you explore enough and enough people are getting on board and getting excited, maybe you just reach a tipping point where the whole organization does tumble into new ways of working. And the big lightning bolt is just a tipping point. It's not an external stimulus. It's just we reach critical mass within the organization. And we need to buffer. We need to provide, actually it should be white rather than blue. We need to create, because I talk about creating white space, which is blue, which is not right, or teal. We need to create white space around this internal bubble that is trying to work in the new ways. We need a moat, a barrier, a protective space, a white space from the broader organization, which is still working in the older ways. So we want a protective space around them. And so the local managers, it's primarily on them to try and create protection and space from the broader organization. So for example, they're still working as projects in the outer space, and we're trying to work as product oriented in the inner space. And then there are 4 primary areas of interface that we have to deal with, which is directions and controls coming in, and reporting and feedback going out, and money coming in and results coming out. And we have to translate between how the outer world sees those and how we see them in these 4 interface points. So our internal reporting has to be translated into their reporting. Their directives and principles coming in and policies coming in have to be translated into our directives and policies internally, and so on. There's 4 bufferings that go. Or provide air cover is another phrase I use, or run interference. You know, protect the bubble for as long as we can. Now, you can't protect it forever. Eventually the broader system will kill it. If we don't get on the previous slide to that lightning bolt, if we don't at some point start that transformation to incubate, adopt, and transform, then eventually all of these exploratory experimental bubbles will die. This is a transitional phase, an interim phase that has a finite period we can sustain it. It's a tension, and it won't last. If we stay in that explore phase too long, these bubbles will be killed by eventually be stifled by the broader organization. We do want to work incrementally. So we want these pockets of ideas to break out all over the organization at different slices and different times, and just slowly build our way up, adopting incrementally until we eventually color in the whole picture. You know, this is the opposite of the Big Bang. And you can function for years and years and years with bits of the organization who are still old school, if you have to. Which is actually an advantage in a way, because human beings are on the same bell curve, right? And so there are people who take years to get this stuff. And if you're transforming incrementally, there are places that they can survive for years with their old thinking before they finally see the light and come on board. There are pockets of the organization where the dinosaurs can still stride the valleys, right? The hidden valleys in the organization, the lost islands. There's a model in the book which talks about how to hack the organization. And if you want to understand that model, you're going to have to read the book. Or, ta-da, some of you will have seen that I'm having so much fun doing this that I've scheduled some more training courses. And so the last few slides that we've gone through I'm going to do next week in 3 days on the advancement process. How do you get to new ways? How do you hack the org? So we've talked about new thinking, new working, new managing, new practices. Tomorrow is the new you, and what it means for us as individuals.